Good afternoon. I promise I'll be short because I believe everybody's tired already. And I will not read an academic paper. It's only 2 pages and a half. So I'd like to invite your full attention because at the end I would be happy to be able to leave you. I would be happy to have you leaving this event reflecting about the notion of empowerment that I'll talk about in your communities, in your countries, since we have such a diversity here today. And the reason why I chose to talk about empowerment, according to the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire, is first, it's a way to share a little bit about my culture. I come from Brazil. Paulo Freire was an international educator from Brazil. And second, because I really believe that the notion of empowerment, according to his view, could be tremendously helpful for all of us here in our communities, in our countries, in our organizations, when trying to work on cultural diplomacy. So I would like to ask, as an exercise of cultural diplomacy, your full attention, and I promise I'll be short. Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator, author of the term empowerment in its transformative sense. Paulo Freire once said, "I would like to be remembered as someone who loved the world, the people, the animals, the trees, the water, life." This brief reflection is not an academic work, but an invitation to discuss empowerment in the global context of cultural diplomacy. The goal is to steer the discussion from a Freirean perspective in the annual Conference of Cultural Diplomacy in the UN, New York City, 2017. The Brazilian educator Paulo Freire is among the most influential thinkers of education in the 20th century. He was born in Recife, the capital of Pernambuco state in Brazil, on September 19, 1921, and died on May 2, 1997, in the city of São Paulo. After a brief career as a lawyer, he taught Portuguese in high school from 1941 to 1947, and later on began to work with adult education and the training of workers, becoming the first director of the Department of Cultural Extension of the University of Recife. Freire quickly gained international recognition for his experience in literacy in the Brazilian Northeast. During the military dictatorship of 1964, the educator was forced to exile first in Bolivia, later in Chile, and other countries as a citizen of the world. In 1969, Paulo Freire was invited to work as a visiting professor at Harvard University, moving later to Cambridge University. In the early 70s, together with other Brazilian exiles in Geneva, Switzerland, he created the Institute for Cultural Action, which advises various popular movements in different parts of the world. During that time, he also acted as a counselor in the educational reform of the Portuguese colonies in Africa. Returning to Brazil in 1980, he continued to work as a writer and debater, taking up positions at universities as well as acting as the Municipal Secretary of Education in the city of São Paulo. One of the best-known works by Paulo Freire is Pedagogy of the Oppressed, 1970, which was first published in Spanish and English, arriving in Brazil only 4 years later due to the military dictatorship and censorship in the country. In this book and other works that followed, the author advocates for an educational system that emphasizes learning as an action of culture and freedom, an interactive process between teacher, student, teacher, in which both learn, and not only the student as it is generally thought. Some concepts developed by Freire, such as banking education, culture of silence, and empowerment, are worth reviewing when discussing cultural diplomacy here at the United Nations in a conference with participants from across the globe. Banking education is when passive learners have pre-established knowledge deposited in their minds, as if they come as empty accounts. Culture of silence is when dominated individuals lose the means of responding critically to the knowledge imposed on them by the dominant culture. And finally, empowerment, the theme of this discussion, is a notion that addresses that although the word already existed in English language, the concept of this word, empowerment, for Paulo Freire follows a different logic. For him, the empowered person, group, or institution are the ones who perform on their own the changes and actions that cause them to grow and become stronger. The power is not given to them, but instead comes from them. That's the key difference of the notion of empowerment for Paulo Freire. Searching for the meaning of the word empowerment, I found the following definitions. Authority or power given to someone to do something. For example, individuals are given empowerment to create their own dwellings. Or as the Merriam-Webster dictionary defines the verb to empower as to give official authority or legal power to someone, to empower her authority to act on her behalf, for example. Complementing the definitions above, the American Heritage Dictionary presents the following example for the use of the verb to empower. We want to empower ordinary citizens. So again, the idea of giving something, allowing them to do something. Based on these examples, we may observe that the common definition of the term implies a passive state in which the person receives empowerment. Differently from this logic, Freire's definition of empowerment implies a conquest, the advancement and prevailing by the one who is empowered, active subject of the process, and not a simple donation or transfer by benevolence, which transforms the subject into a passive object. It can be argued that Paulo Freire developed a special meaning for the word empowerment in the context of philosophy and education, defining it not as a movement that occurs from the outside to the inside, but internally. It essentially involves obtaining adequate information, a process of reflection and awareness of one's present condition, a clear formulation of desired changes, and the condition to be built. To these variables must be added a change of attitude that impels the person, group, or institution to the practical, methodical, and systematic action in the sense of the goals and objectives outlined, and abandoning the old merely reactive or receptive posture. For Freire, the term derives from the idea of liberation of the oppressed. Empowerment is in this case seen as the Freirean notion of the conquest of freedom by persons who have been subordinated to a position of economic or physical dependence or of any other nature. He once said, "The oppressed people, having internalized the image of the oppressor and adopted his or her lines of action, are afraid of freedom. Freedom would require them to reject this image and fill their place with autonomy and responsibility. Freedom is acquired by conquest, not as a gift, and therefore it must be constantly sought. Freedom is not an ideal located outside of the human being, nor it is an idea that becomes a myth. It is undoubtedly the indispensable condition of the search for human complementation. Empowerment, therefore, differs from the simple construction of skills and competences, knowledge commonly associated with formal school. Empowerment education differs from formal knowledge both by its emphasis on groups more than individuals and its focus on cultural transformation rather than social adaptation. With this brief article, I intended to positively influence the dissemination of information about the Freirean meaning of the term empowerment because, as Paulo Freire pointed out, when people can incorporate new knowledge, the human being is strengthened, which is the first step towards empowerment. I invite you to reflect about how the Freirean notion of empowerment can help you build international relations, economic development, innovation, new markets, and global human rights in your communities and in your countries. Thank you.